year 1863 dawned cold and gray over Galveston Island. Union sailors aboard their warships in the harbor celebrated the new year, confident in their control of Texas's most important port. They had seized Galveston back in October, and now federal forces occupied the wharves while Union gunboats patrolled the waters. The Confederate flag no longer flew over the island. Texas's gateway to the Gulf of Mexico had fallen. But 50 miles inland, in Houston, a plan was taking shape that would become one of the most audacious and unlikely military operations of the entire war. Major General John Bankhead Magruder, called Prince John for his theatrical personality and love of grand gestures, stared at a problem that seemed impossible to solve. He had orders to retake Galveston, but he had no navy. The Union controlled the water with powerful warships bristling with cannons. Magruder's Confederates had infantry and artillery, but what good were soldiers on land when the enemy ruled the waves? The answer, when it came, seemed almost ridiculous. If the Confederates couldn't build proper warships, they'd make their own out of whatever they could find. They'd armor river steamboats with cotton bales and turn them into improvised gunboats. These Cottonclads, as they came to be called, would become the stuff of legend, and the key to one of the war's most spectacular victories. In the busy port of Houston, two river steamers, the Bayou City and the Neptune, were hauled up to the docks for the strangest transformation anyone had ever seen. Workers swarmed over the vessels, constructing wooden frames along their decks. These frames would hold walls of cotton bales, stacked and lashed together to create makeshift armor. The logic was sound, even if the execution looked makeshift. Cotton bales were dense and would absorb or deflect small arms fire and even light artillery shells. They were also readily available in a state that literally ran on cotton exports. What the South lacked in industrial shipyards and iron plating, it would make up for with agricultural abundance and desperate ingenuity. But Magruder didn't stop with just armoring the boats. He added an element that would have seemed comical if it weren't so deadly serious. He loaded the vessels with cavalry soldiers. These mounted troops, who normally fought on horseback across open prairies, would now serve as horse marines, sharpshooters who would fire from behind the cotton bale walls as the steamers charged into battle. Among these improvised naval warriors was a young cavalryman named Tom Green, who had never been in a naval battle in his life. Like his fellow horse marines, he'd trained to fight on land, not water. Now he stood on the deck of a repurposed steamboat, checking his rifle and trying not to think too hard about what they were about to attempt. "This is madness," his friend whispered beside him, watching workers stack the final cotton bales. Tom nodded but kept his voice steady. "Maybe so, but it's our kind of madness." Magruder's strategy relied on perfect coordination and timing, two things notoriously difficult to achieve in warfare, especially at night. The plan called for a simultaneous assault from land and sea. On land, Confederate infantry would attack the Union garrison positioned at Coon's Wharf in downtown Galveston. Their job was to pin down the Federal soldiers, preventing them from reinforcing their ships or escaping. At the same time, the Cottonclads would steam into the harbor under cover of darkness and attack the Union fleet from behind, where they wouldn't be expected. The Union ships would be caught between two threats: artillery fire from land and the charging Cottonclads from the water. It was bold. It was risky. And it had to happen on New Year's Day, 1863, in the darkness before dawn. As midnight passed and January 1st arrived, Confederate forces moved into position. The infantrymen, carrying ladders they hoped would be tall enough to scale the wharf, crept through the darkened streets of Galveston. Their commanders had ordered absolute silence: no talking, no coughing, no sound that might alert the Union sentries. At 4 a.m., the land assault began, with a sudden crash of artillery and rifle fire. Confederate cannons opened up on the wharf from carefully prepared positions. their muzzle flashes lighting up the pre-dawn darkness like lightning. The Union troops, jolted awake, scrambled to their defensive positions and began returning fire. But then came the first problem. When Confederate infantry rushed forward with their ladders, ready to climb up and storm the wharf, they made a horrifying discovery. The ladders were too short. The men found themselves trapped at the base of the wharf, unable to advance, but also unable to retreat without exposing themselves to murderous fire from the Union positions above them. The land assault was stalling. The plan was falling apart. And then, out of the darkness of the harbor, came the Cottonclads. The Bayou City and the Neptune, moving slowly through the dark water, approached the Union fleet. On the decks, the Horse Marines gripped their rifles, peering over the cotton bale walls at the shadowy shapes of Union warships ahead. The Union sailors spotted the approaching vessels and opened fire. Cannonballs slammed into the cotton bales, some punching through, others embedding themselves in the dense fiber. The noise was tremendous, cannons booming, men shouting, the steam engines of the Cottonclads chugging and straining. The Neptune, taking heavy fire, shuddered as cannon shot tore into its vulnerable parts. Water began pouring into the hull. The crew fought to keep it afloat, to make it just a little farther, but the damage was too severe. The Neptune began to sink in the shallow harbor water, settling onto the bottom with its upper deck still above the waterline. Its part in the battle was over. But the Bayou City pressed on. Captain Leon Smith, commanding the Bayou City, steered his ungainly vessel directly at the USS Harriet Lane, one of the most powerful Union warships in the harbor. The Harriet Lane's crew saw the Cottonclad coming and poured fire into it. One of the Bayou City's own cannons exploded from the strain of firing, killing and wounding several men. Smoke and chaos filled the deck. But Smith didn't waver. "Ram her," he shouted. "Ram her and board." The Bayou City picked up what speed it could and slammed into the Harriet Lane with a splintering crash. Before the Union sailors could recover from the impact, Confederate Horse Marines were leaping across the gap between vessels, firing their rifles and drawing pistols and knives for close-quarters combat. The fight on the Harriet Lane's deck was brutal and personal. Men grappled hand to hand, firing at point-blank range, swinging rifle butts and cutlasses. The Union commander fought desperately to repel the boarders, but the Confederates kept coming, pouring over the sides in a howling rush. In the savage melee, the Union commander was killed. His men, seeing their leader fall and realizing they were being overwhelmed, began to surrender. The Confederates had captured the Harriet Lane. While the boarding action raged, another tragedy was unfolding elsewhere in the harbor. The Union flagship, the USS Westfield, had run aground during the confusion of battle. Its commander, William B. Renshaw, made a fateful decision. Rather than let his ship fall into Confederate hands, he would destroy it himself. Renshaw ordered his crew to abandon ship while he set explosive charges in the powder magazine. The plan was to light the fuses, evacuate, and let the ship blow itself to pieces. But something went terribly wrong. As Renshaw worked to set the charges, the explosives detonated prematurely. The Westfield erupted in a massive explosion that lit up the harbor like daylight. Renshaw and several crew members who had stayed with him were killed instantly, blown apart by the blast. The explosion marked the beginning of the end for the Union fleet. The remaining Federal warships, witnessing the capture of the Harriet Lane and the destruction of the Westfield, made the decision to retreat. They weighed anchor and steamed out of Galveston Harbor, abandoning the Union troops on shore. Those Federal soldiers on Coon's Wharf, who had been fighting off the Confederate land attack all through the early morning, now found themselves in an impossible position. Their ships were gone. They were cut off, outnumbered, and out of options. They had no choice but to surrender. As the sun rose on January 1st, 1863, the Confederate flag once again flew over Galveston. Against all odds, using makeshift cotton-armored steamboats and cavalrymen playing at being sailors, the Confederates had recaptured Texas's most important port. While Galveston was Texas's grandest coastal victory, the fight for Corpus Christi 8 months earlier, in August 1862, showed the same spirit of improvisation and stubborn resistance, with a bizarre twist that became the stuff of legend. Corpus Christi, sitting on its bay along the South Texas coast, was important primarily as a port for smuggling goods in and out of Texas. Union Lieutenant J.W. Kittredge commanded a small squadron of ships tasked with enforcing the blockade and stopping this trade. The USS Arthur, Sachem, and Corypheus patrolled the waters, occasionally shelling Confederate positions on shore. In August, Kittredge decided to force the issue. He sent a message to Confederate Major Alfred Hobby, demanding the right to send Union troops ashore to inspect government buildings in Corpus Christi. The unspoken threat was clear: comply or face bombardment. Major Hobby's response was equally clear: no. Kittredge made good on his threat. Union cannons opened up on the small city, sending shells crashing into buildings. The bombardment was meant to intimidate the Confederates into submission, to show them the futility of resistance. It didn't work. On August 18th, Kittredge decided to land troops and seize the Confederate battery by force. Union sailors rowed ashore, hauling a howitzer with them, ready to take the position and plant the United States flag. What happened next would have seemed more at home in a Western frontier story than a Civil War naval battle. Captain James A. Ware, commanding Confederate cavalry in the area, heard about the landing. He immediately gathered his mounted troops and charged toward the beach. The Union sailors, who had expected to fight artillery crews and infantry, suddenly found themselves facing a cavalry charge, something their naval training had never prepared them for. Horses thundering across the sand, Confederates shouting and firing from the saddle. The whole scene must have seemed surreal to the Union sailors. They had been trained to fight ship to ship, to serve cannons, to navigate by the stars, not to face a cavalry assault on a beach. The sailors broke and ran for their boats, abandoning their howitzer in their haste to escape. They rowed frantically back to their ships while Confederate bullets kicked up splashes in the water around them. The attempted landing had failed completely. But the strangest part of the battle came after the Union fleet renewed its bombardment in frustration. As Union ships poured fire on Corpus Christi, Confederate soldiers noticed something peculiar. Many of the shells fired at them were duds. They'd land but not explode. This happened far too often to be normal. Artillery shells weren't that unreliable. Curious Confederates retrieved some of the unexploded shells after the battle. When they carefully opened them, they made an astonishing discovery. Instead of gunpowder, the shells were filled with fine bourbon whiskey. The explanation, passed down through soldier accounts and local lore, was almost too perfect. Union sailors, prohibited from having liquor aboard ship, had apparently been stealing it when they could, and needed a place to hide it from their officers. Hollow artillery shells seemed like the perfect hiding spot. They'd drill a hole in the shell, pour out the gunpowder, pour in the whiskey, plug the hole, and return the shell to the magazine. No one suspected a thing, until those same shells were loaded and fired in the heat of battle. The sailors who had hidden their contraband probably had no idea their whiskey-filled shells were being used in combat. They certainly didn't intend to fire bourbon at the Confederates instead of explosives. Whether the story is entirely true or somewhat embellished over the years, it became part of Corpus Christi's Civil War legend. It represented the often absurd and unpredictable nature of the war along the Texas coast, where cavalry charged beaches cotton became armor, and artillerymen might dodge whiskey bottles instead of explosives. The Union fleet eventually gave up trying to take Corpus Christi. Like Galveston, it remained in Confederate hands, another coastal victory for Texas defenders who refused to surrender their ports without a fight. If Galveston was impressive and Corpus Christi was quirky, then the Second Battle of Sabine Pass in September 1863 was nothing short of miraculous. A victory so complete and one-sided that it defied belief. Sabine Pass was the point where the Sabine River emptied into the Gulf of Mexico, forming the border between Texas and Louisiana. Control of this waterway meant control of access to the Texas interior and the critical rail lines that connected Texas to the rest of the Confederacy. In September 1863, the Union planned a major invasion of Texas through Sabine Pass. This wasn't a raid or a small operation. This was a full-scale amphibious assault designed to cut Texas off from Louisiana and potentially capture Houston and Galveston from the landward side. The invasion force was massive. 4 Union gunboats escorting nearly 24 transport ships carrying between 4,000 and 5,000 soldiers, along with artillery and supplies for a sustained campaign. It was one of the largest amphibious operations the Union had attempted in the entire theater. Standing against this armada was Fort Griffin, a small earthen fortification guarding the pass. And manning Fort Griffin was Company F of the 1st Texas Heavy Artillery, a unit known as the Davis Guards. The Davis Guards numbered approximately 40 to 47 men. Most were Irish immigrants who had worked as dock workers in Houston and Galveston before the war. Their commander was Lieutenant Richard Dick Dowling, a 26-year-old saloon keeper from Houston. 47 men against 5,000. 6 cannons against dozens of naval guns and hundreds of soldiers. On paper, it wasn't even a contest. But Lieutenant Dowling had a plan. Dick Dowling might have run a saloon in peacetime, but he approached artillery with the precision of a master craftsman. He understood that his tiny force could only win if every single shot counted, if every cannonball found its target. So Dowling did something that seemed simple, but was actually quite brilliant. He planted range stakes in the channel. The Sabine Pass channel was narrow, and ships entering it would have to follow a specific path to avoid running aground. Dowling placed wooden stakes in the water at carefully measured intervals. He and his gunners practiced endlessly, learning exactly how to aim their cannons when an enemy ship reached each stake. They didn't have to guess the range or estimate the distance. They knew exactly where to point their guns when a vessel crossed each marker. The Irish gunners drilled obsessively. Load, aim, fire, swab, reload. Over and over. They became so fast and accurate that they could put multiple shots on target in the time it took most artillery crews to fire once. They were ready. Now, they just had to wait. The morning of September 8th dawned clear and bright. From Fort Griffin, the Davis Guards could see the Union fleet assembling at the mouth of the pass, ship after ship, a forest of masts and smokestacks, thousands of men preparing to invade Texas. A young private named Patrick Henry, standing at his gun position, might have turned to his friend and said, "Mother Mary, would you look at that? There must be 100 ships out there." "Aye," his friend might have replied, "and here's us, just a handful of Irishmen and our 6 little cannons. We're either very brave or very stupid." "Both, I'd say." Patrick might have grinned despite his nervousness. "Both." Lieutenant Dowling gathered his men. He reminded them of their training, of the stakes they'd planted, of how important it was to remain calm and aim true. The fate of Texas might depend on what they did in the next hour. The Union gunboats began their approach. The USS Clifton, Sachem, Granite City, and Arizona steamed toward the pass with their guns run out, ready to blast Fort Griffin into rubble before landing the thousands of troops waiting in the transports. Dowling watched them come. Closer. Closer. His men stood ready at their cannons, matches lit, waiting for the order. The lead Union ships crossed the first range stake. Still, Dowling waited. They crossed the second stake. The men at the guns tensed, ready to fire. Then the ships entered the kill zone, the area where all 6 of Dowling's cannons could concentrate their fire with pinpoint accuracy. Fire! 35 minutes of perfect fury. What happened next was a masterclass in artillery gunnery. The Davis Guards opened up with a speed and accuracy that stunned the Union fleet. The USS Sachem was hit in the boiler almost immediately. Superheated steam exploded through the engine room, scalding sailors and crippling the vessel. The ship went dead in the water, unable to maneuver or retreat. The USS Clifton attempted to navigate around the disabled Sachem, but ran aground on the shallow bottom. Now it was a sitting target. Confederate shells slammed into it repeatedly, tearing through its armor and wreaking havoc on its crew. The Davis Guards worked their guns like demons. Each crew had practiced so much that they moved in perfect synchronization. One man swabbing the barrel while another rammed home the charge, a third positioning the shot, a fourth aiming, all in a continuous rhythm. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. In between 35 and 45 minutes of furious combat, the Irish gunners fired somewhere between 107 and 137 rounds. The accuracy was devastating. Nearly every shot hit its target. The Union gunboats, designed to pummel shore fortifications into submission with overwhelming firepower, found themselves being systematically destroyed by a handful of Confederates who shot too fast and too accurately for the Yankees to respond effectively. Both the Sachem and the Clifton were forced to surrender, their captains having no choice with their ships crippled and their crews being killed. The Davis Guards captured both vessels and took approximately 350 Union prisoners, nearly 8 times their own number. The transport ships, witnessing the destruction of their escort, turned around and fled back out to sea. The invasion of Texas was over before a single Union soldier had set foot on shore. The Butcher's Bill told the story. The Union lost roughly 50 men killed and 350 captured, plus 2 gunboats. The Davis Guards suffered 0 casualties, not 1 man killed, not 1 wounded. It was the most one-sided victory of the entire Civil War. News of the victory at Sabine Pass electrified the Confederacy at a time when good news was increasingly rare. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who rarely praised individual units, called it the most remarkable in military history, and compared it to the Spartans' stand at Thermopylae. Each man of the Davis Guards received a special medal, the Davis Guard Medal, struck from silver Mexican pesos. It was the only such medal officially authorized by the Confederate Congress during the entire war. Lieutenant Dowling became an instant hero. The saloon keeper, who had never received formal military training, had just defeated an invasion fleet with nothing but careful preparation, good leadership, and Irish dock workers who could shoot straight. But Dowling, when asked about the battle, was characteristically modest. "We just did our duty," he reportedly said. "The boys shot well, that's all." The victories at Galveston, Corpus Christi, and Sabine Pass established a pattern that would hold for the rest of the war. Texas's coast was defended, and it would not be easily taken. Unlike other Confederate coastal areas, where Union forces established beachheads and gradually pushed inland, Texas remained largely under Confederate control. The cotton road to Mexico stayed open. Supplies continued to flow. The economic lifeline that kept the Trans-Mississippi Confederacy alive remained intact. This was partly due to geography. Texas was far from the main theaters of war and difficult to invade across vast distances. But it was also due to the determination of defenders who fought with everything they had, who turned river steamboats into warships, who practiced artillery until they could shoot with impossible accuracy, who charged Union landing parties on horseback across beaches. As 1863 turned into 1864, Texas remained defiant. Its ports still operated, its border with Mexico still funneled trade, and its defenders had proven they would fight cleverly and fiercely to keep it that way. But while Texas defended its home ground successfully, its sons were bleeding and dying in far-off places. From the cornfields of Maryland to the rocky slopes of Pennsylvania, from the streets of Tennessee to the trenches of Mississippi, Texans were making a name for themselves as some of the fiercest fighters in Confederate service. And they were paying for that reputation with their blood. Be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next video in this series when we'll follow Hood's Texas Brigade to the Eastern Theater, where their courage and ferocity would earn them immortal fame and horrific casualties that would become the stuff of both legend and nightmares. If you have anything you'd like to see us cover, please let us know in the comments. Until next time, stay curious